When you picture yourself having finally mastered a foreign language, what mental images arise? What type of situation would it be most motivating to see yourself navigating successfully in the future? Well, most people, when they say that somebody has learned a foreign language and mastered it, they're referring basically to the person's ability to speak and be understood. And the special allure that being able to hold a conversation with foreigners in their native language with ease holds reflects the fact that language is an inherently social phenomenon. Now, I want to get into just a little bit of language acquisition theory, and then we'll look right away at some practical applications of that. So, one of three very widespread theories about how language acquisition occurs is the social interactionist theory. And that was originally developed by a Soviet psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky, sorry on the pronunciation, and it was widely disseminated in the West by another psychologist, Jerome Bruner, an American. And what it says is that children acquire their mother tongue in tandem with a cognitive development of a mental model of the social world. So children seek out linguistic interaction with their parents and others because underlying that they have a communicative intent. They want to interact socially, and therefore they seek out the development of language, linguistic interactions, and therefore they develop language as a way to communicate socially. So that's referring mostly to first language acquisition. What about second language acquisition? Well, there's a similar angle on that. It's called the interaction hypothesis. And what the interaction hypothesis posits is that in acquiring a second language, direct interaction and conversation is really critical. And the reason is that in conversation, speakers negotiate meaning. And in doing so, there is ideal input for language acquisition, right? So unlike if you're watching a movie and it's too advanced for you, it's going to fly by, you don't understand it. When you're conversing, when you're in dialogue, the other speaker will modify their input. They'll mediate the language for you in a way that makes it approachable and that you can engage with and learn from. So practically speaking, what does this shed light, and what light does this shed on some key questions surrounding speaking in a foreign language? Well, first of all, there are other theories about language acquisition, but what the foregoing theoretical discussion helps to elucidate is that speaking in a foreign language, having conversation in a foreign language is highly motivating, it's cognitively stimulating, and it provides ideal input for the language learner. So one question that people commonly have about conversation is, should students engage in speaking early on in the language acquisition process, or should they wait? Should they delay conversation until after they've acquired enough vocabulary and grammar and other skills? So it's very common to have methods where for the first few semesters, students hardly engage in any conversation. They're just passively learning the language. The social interactionist theory and the interaction hypothesis point in the opposite direction, right? So if students are deprived of the opportunity and the challenge to speak in a foreign language for a long time, best case scenario, their learning is going to be really slow because the language is not going to be really real for them. They're going to not have that level of motivation and engagement with the language that you only get when you're forced to try to communicate in it. And worst case scenario, students will become so bored and demotivated that they'll give up before they even reach that advanced level at which supposedly they would then be ready for conversation classes. Students should be encouraged to experiment with the language, try to communicate it, make mistakes, and just have fun with the language early on, because that makes it real for them. That gives them a whole other level of engagement and motivation, which will therefore make them more interested and therefore more focused when they're studying the other language skills as well. Reading and writing and listening and even studying vocabulary and grammar. They'll be more into it. A second common question is, should conversation classes be highly structured or should they be free-flowing? So I cringe when I see methods where the speaking component of the course is reading dialogues and just repeating these rote structures, maybe modifying a noun here, an adjective there, but just, kind of repeating mechanically something over and over again. That's not conversation. And there's no motivation in that because there's no social interaction in it, right? Now, there is a place for structured dialogue, structured conversation in language acquisition. For beginners, it can be really valuable. And when you're introducing or really want to focus on a specific grammatical structure, again, structured dialogue can be quite useful. But generally speaking, because we need social interaction, as we discussed in language acquisition, it's free-flowing, more spontaneous conversation that's going to make that happen and make the language come to life. And so, we need many hundreds of hours of speaking in addition to the other language skills in order to master a language. And that's going to happen. Students are going to remain engaged when conversations are real and interesting. And that's going to happen when they're free-flowing, right? A third question is it important to speak with native speakers, have conversations with native speakers, or is that unimportant? Well, there's a lot of angles on that question. I'm going to get more into it in the third video about speaking and language acquisition. But I just want to bring this whole discussion about social interaction into this question about native speakers. So a way we can approach that question is by asking another question. Is there a difference speaking a foreign language to a native speaker or to a non-native speaker in terms of the social interaction component? Well, from my own experience, I would say definitely yes. It can be fun to speak in a foreign language with somebody from your own country who shares your native language for a while, but after some time it starts getting old and it feels unnatural. Whereas speaking to a native speaker is really the kind of ultimate thrill to be able to successfully communicate with native speakers in their language. And so that's much more, it just feels more real, again, from a social interaction standpoint, more real, more authentic. And therefore, again, back to those hundreds and hundreds of hours that you need, you're going to be able to sustain your interest and your motivation when that conversation really feels authentic. It feels like you need to speak that language in order to communicate with that person. And so that's more likely to happen with native speakers. So, lastly, how can you, starting today, get more conversation into your language learning routine? Well, one way, just go to this post on the blog and you'll see a link to sign up for meetup groups in English, Portuguese, Spanish, by the way, Brazilian Portuguese, European Portuguese, Latin American Spanish, European Spanish, and French. That's for free and it's with native speakers. So that's a great way to get started adding more conversation to your language studies. Thanks for joining me.